All right. I'm here today to talk to you guys about FedRAMP. I'm going to give you guys just a really basic overview of it, so I'm not really sure how many people are super familiar with FedRAMP. So who's heard of FedRAMP at least? Well, I guess you've heard of it since you're in the room. That's probably a dumb question. How many, if you're like, how many think that you're experts in FedRAMP or know it really well? Perfect. All right, well, so I'm going to give you guys basically an overview of it and let you know where we're going with the program as well over the next 2 years and some things that we're doing and building out. But it's really going to be easier and I think better for everybody if, as I'm going along, please feel free to shout out, ask a question, tell me to stop, say something you didn't understand, or you want me to go in more depth. Please do that. It's going to be way more entertaining, and that way I just don't have to talk the entire time because you're probably going to get bored of my voice by the end anyway. And then she'll be running around with a microphone in case people have questions. So to get started, FedRAMP, as an overview, we were established by an OMB policy memo in 2012. It started, though, probably in early 2010 as an idea. But we're really the first government-wide security authorization program for FISMA. And so a lot of times when you hear problems with FedRAMP, it's kind of a misstated problem because it's actually something that FISMA exists in FISMA already. All we are doing is FISMA for cloud. FedRAMP is FISMA for cloud. I'll say it one more time so that way people hear it. FedRAMP is FISMA for cloud. Because we still get a lot of questions that come into our office saying, so if I do FedRAMP, what about my FISMA authorization? It's the exact same. If you do FedRAMP, you are complying with FISMA. And one really cool thing about FedRAMP, I think, that has shown the success of it is that the framework that we have, of this do once, use many times framework, is actually being modeled by other government security programs, so whether you're looking at mobile or data, but also other countries like Canada, the UK, EU, and China. What we're trying to do is make sure that we have the really rigorous application of FISMA to cloud systems. And when we do that, since it's a government-wide program, we can also find efficiencies within FISMA. It's really hard to find efficiencies within FISMA when you're doing one authorization. So right, if you're doing one system at an agency, it's really kind of hard to start to identify efficiencies. Those really come as you're doing a lot of systems and more and more. And so that's something we've been able to really try and find within FedRAMP and something I'll point out through the rest of the slides. Also, just at the beginning, I like to put up front, this is actually an old figure. We're in the middle of rebaselining to actually get to a better figure, but off of the 2014 or 2015 FISMA metrics, we know that we are in at least 160 implementations FedRAMP authorizations cover, and it's estimated through FISMA that each security authorization costs roughly $250,000. So if you apply that to each one of them, that's $40 million in savings right there that the government has experienced by FedRAMP. That's pretty significant, particularly considering we're barely over 3 years old. Those authorizations take anywhere from 6 to 12 months on average, and that was only with, I think at the time, we only had 24 authorizations when we were covering that, and right now we have 38. So clearly that number is very low. It will continue to go up and we'll have a better figure, but I just think that's also something that cost $12 million to create FedRAMP when we did that figure, and we'd already saved $40 million. It's pretty good ROI, and it really sort of demonstrates why you should be doing it at your agency too. One agency, HHS, who did the Amazon authorization, they estimated internally that they saved over roughly 80% against doing it in each operational division like they would have done before FedRAMP. So it is something that not only, it does take time and energy to do FedRAMP, but it definitely has an ROI in terms of the return on investment for saving money at your agency. So how does it fit into to what you're doing at your agency already? When we built FedRAMP, we didn't want to create something new. I know it sounds new because it's a new term, it's a new program, but we wanted to make sure that we were doing it in the current context of what agencies were doing. We knew if we had to tell you, if you do cyber this way for traditional IT and you do cyber this way for cloud, and it's going to be different, no one would do it. And you're creating two different systems. We wanted to make sure it was the same system agencies are already doing. So if you look at the sort of way that the policies sort of line up, it starts with the law, FISMA, the eGov Act of 2002. That says, hey, agency, if you have government data, you must authorize that system before you use it, right? You have to put security around it. OMB put out Circular A130, which says you must use the NIST standards to actually do that authorization. So the law says you must authorize it. OMB through A130 says you must use the NIST framework to actually do those authorizations. FedRAMP goes on top of that, and FedRAMP says, here's how you actually implement those FISMA and those NIST 800 series documents. And I'll go through how we simplify that for it. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be an agency authorization. When we were building it, We wanted to see if there was a way to do one authorization for government, right? Someone authorizes it, everyone can use it. That's simply not the way the law works. The law says each head of agency must authorize an IT system. They are the owner of their data, they must authorize it. So there can't be one authorization that everyone uses, but what you can do is create that body of evidence through FedRAMP that everyone can use that evidence to grant their own authorization. So it's not quite getting one authorization across government, but at least the evidence and everything like that is there to enable reuse from one agency to the other. So this is an incident risk management framework. This is what agencies should be doing. Hopefully this is not unfamiliar to all of you. But it's 6 steps. This is how you actually go through and authorize a system. So the first step is going to be categorizing the information system. So you need to go back and look at your data and figure out what's the protections that are needed for that data. And NIST has 3 different categorizations: low, moderate, and high. Right now, FedRAMP covers low and moderate. We are working on a high baseline, which should be finalized by the end of the calendar year. But you're going to go back and you're looking at if it's a low and moderate, then you're going to go through and you're going to select the controls. So it's this type of data. Then you're going to select the controls that are needed to actually protect that data at those different levels. Then you're going to implement those security controls, and in this case, you're not going to be implementing them. Your cloud provider will be implementing it, but you're going to enforce that they're actually implemented. And they're going to describe it in the system security plan and all of those details and those documents. Then it's going to go out and get assessed. You have to use an independent assessor. Some agencies have their own independent assessors. We've accredited a group of assessors called 3 PAOs. Or 3 PALs, and also because the government needs to have as many acronyms as possible. So I wanted to throw another one out there. And then after it's gone through and it's been assessed and you get those results, that evidence that demonstrates the risk of the system, you go through and you authorize it. And the most important part is the monitoring the security controls or continuous monitoring. It's not, FISMA usually is critiqued by an credit and forget it mentality. Right, everyone remembers those systems where you put together the big package, the big binder, you put it on the desk, and 3 years later, dusted it off and looked at it. Really can't do that in a cloud environment. Cloud environments are super dynamic, they're changing all the time, so you need to make sure you're actually doing continuous monitoring. I think that's by far the most important step up there. But I'm a simple person. 6 steps is way too much because you have to use 2 hands. So we simplified it to do 4 steps. Document, assess, authorize, and monitor. Really, the reason we can sort of combine those 3 first steps is that we do have a defined baseline and defined controls. So you're going to go through with a cloud provider, and we call it the security assessment framework instead of the risk management framework, but the security assessment framework, because again, we had to have something shorter to call it. So the SAF, again, another acronym. Also needed to be a different acronym, right? So in the document phase, like I said, you're going to go through, but the interesting thing about FedRAMP compared to internal government sort of IT systems is the fact that the cloud provider is actually documenting it, right? You're not actually documenting the information. What you're doing is validating those implementations through the documentation itself. Everyone always wants to know how long it takes. There are 3 paths, and I'll go through at the end and sort of talk about the difference between the paths. But as you go through that document, assess, authorize, and monitor, you're going to look for a JAB if you're doing it through the Joint Authorization Board. It's going to take roughly 9 months. We're looking on average right now between 9 to 12 months for authorizations. Agency authorizations, we say roughly 4 months. Probably on average, it's more like 6 to 9. And then we have one called the Cloud Service Provider Supplied, which is basically cloud providers that do it on their own and provide all the documentation. I'll get onto that in a little bit. But we say that could probably be done by a provider in roughly 6 weeks. And that's post-testing and all of that. So that first phase, what have we done to make it easier for you guys? Obviously the NIST risk management framework is not new. The 800 series documents have been out there and have been public for a while, but it's still confusing for people. So we want to make sure we try to figure out a way also within that framework to make sure that we figured out a way to have agencies trust each other. I'm sure if all of you looked at your friends next to you at the other agency, you would trust their work, right? No one's nodding their head. Government doesn't trust each other. It's sad to say, but it's true. And so what we try to do within FedRAMP is make sure that we can have a way for you to trust the work that's been done. And so in the document phase, the first one is categorizing the information system. So since we have a defined baseline, all of the controls within categorizing the information system, within selecting the security controls, all the controls that are in there have to be addressed. right? So at each agency, typically you'd go through and you'd tailor the baseline. You would have some controls you wanted, some controls you didn't want, didn't matter, and you would justify it and have different baselines across the government. With FedRAMP, you don't have to implement all the security controls. Everyone thinks you have to implement all of them. You don't. What you have to do is document how you meet each control or don't meet it. If you don't think a control is important for your data, you have to document why and make a risk-based determination to say, I don't need that implementation. And so that allows agencies to at least see the evidence across agencies or across systems so that you can actually reuse the work that they did. And the thing that gives real power here too is that, and I think sadly is probably why not more agencies have done as many authorizations as we would like, is because we validate it at the PMO. Right? So if you've ever gone and tried to leverage an authorization at another agency, how many people have tried to do that actually? Tried to reuse an authorization at another agency? Only one person? Come on, you guys. That's sad. But you guys, so if you went to, we tried to do it when we were launching FedRAMP to use the system, and it was really hard to get agencies to share that documentation, right? Because no one wants to share bad work. And so what we're doing is we're making sure that agencies are actually doing this right. So if you do it, the cloud provider, I mean, the onus is on the cloud provider at the end of the day, but the government, you are authorizing it based off documentation. We then validate that all of that documentation is there. So when you go through and you select those controls, again, it's only going to be low and moderate for right now, but you have to address all of them. And when you look at implementing them and documenting them, the power of what we've done with FedRAMP is created standardized templates. And they are mandatory, which means all of you should groan because no one likes mandatory templates, I know. But the power behind them is that it allows you to be able to compare apples to apples. So if you want to do one infrastructure provider and you want an infrastructure, let's say at your agency, all the providers do their implementations differently, right? And they all have varying levels of risk. But how are you able to actually analyze that in the same way? If you're not doing it off the same documentation, you're looking at apples to oranges. So we've done with the templates is made sure that you can actually look at the risk posture and look at the evidence in the same way from each provider. And it goes across from private to public as well as from infrastructure all the way to software. So it allows you to sort of have that standardized approach to being able to review it. And it also gets into some really specific portions of the documentations that are unique to cloud. So there's roughly, I think it's either 6 or 8 different types of responsibility for a control, meaning the provider does the entire responsibility or a customer does their entire responsibility, or somewhere in the middle. So some easy examples of that would be like if you're a software as a service and you're using an infrastructure, the infrastructure provider is always going to have the responsibility for the physical environmental controls. The software isn't going to, right? It's always going to be there. So that description is going to be completely implemented by the provider, nothing on the customer. And then also if you think of two-factor authentication, that's definitely going to be a shared responsibility, right? A provider can provide the capabilities for you to do two-factor authentication, but you end up, as a customer, have to actually implement it, and you have to enforce it. So you have to give all of your people CAT cards and PIV cards. You have to then turn it on and make sure your Active Directories are synced up and ready to go. So there's always, the templates get to that sort of ability to really understand what your responsibility is, what the provider's responsibility is, and it also talks about inheritance. So I mentioned the software provider and an infrastructure provider. You really want to think about, and I'll talk at the end on really how to structure authorizations, but you want to talk about how a software provider can leverage an infrastructure provider and how you're really looking at it from a system perspective. And that software as a service is going to just inherit those physical environmental controls I was talking about. Right, there should be no description in the software provider's controls and their responsibilities about the physical environmental. They have nothing to do with it. So you want to look at those authorizations as distinct systems, and also making sure that within the templates it gives you that ability to do inheritance, which a lot of the documentation that we saw previously didn't have that. Another powerful thing in the documentation is if you look at the NIST security controls, a lot of them have subparts A to like T, right? And when everyone gets to T, who's actually still writing about control implementation T? No one. What we did was we put a simple box for A, a box for B, a box for C, all the way down. That shows really quickly if you've documented it all. Also, if you say C above, nope, don't see above. You should be describing it for that implementation. There's a distinct implementation for part A, for part B, for part C. I mean, we know NIST likes to write a lot, but they are distinct. They're not just writing different implementations for nothing. They are actually distinct things that you should be filling out. We also then, another way we've tried to help is having an implementation guidance. So we have a thing called Guide to Understanding FedRAMP. It talks a lot about some of those things like the inheritance, the shared responsibility, and talks just through some of the ways that you should be implementing or reading those security controls and how some of them have some distinct elements with cloud. So that gives agencies, again, a little bit more information to sort of help them go through the system, go through the process. So we get into assess. You're looking at having an independent assessor go out. This is going to be, we recommend all agencies use third-party assessment organizations. That's the people that we have accredited. There's about 35. Who pays for it is up to the agency and based on your contract. Sometimes agencies pay for it. Most of the time, the cloud provider pays for it. Your agency's paying for it in the end, right? It's going to be covered by the cost of the cloud provider. But that everyone always wants to know who pays. It's really dependent upon how you structure your contract. It's always going to be easier if you have your cloud provider pay for it. But again, I'm sure the cloud providers probably put that cost back into the service that you get. But what these independent assessors do is they go out and actually validate the control implementations. They're going to document the risks associated with their implementations. If anyone thinks that there's a reason it's called a risk management framework. If you think you could go out and make a system that has 0 risks, you should quit your job, you should go build that system because you'll be the richest person in the world. Every system has risk, right? That's simply the way that it is. There's always new attack vectors, there's always bad actors out there trying to do bad things, and there's always ways that they're going to find a vulnerability to exploit. And so what these independent assessors do, though, is they go out and actually make sure that all of those risks are documented so that you can make an informed decision when you go to authorize. So what we've done with those independent assessors is we privatized it in the similar boat of like Underwriters Labs, NavLab, Common Criteria. We use a group called American Association of Laboratory Accreditors, and we actually validate that these 3 PAOs, one, have knowledge of FISMA, that they actually know what FISMA means, they know what the security controls are, they know how to test, but we also validate their independence. So we make sure that they have no ties to cloud providers. We make sure there's no sort of financial gains or anything like that that they could have by doing this assessment work. And we use an ISO standard for that, ISO 17020. So we use an international standard for that. And that way, the one thing that helps with that with 3 PAOs, and it allows you to have your cloud provider pay for it, but know that you're still getting an independent result. There's a lot of agencies that have, some agencies have internal processes or policies where the agency has to pay for an independent assessor because they believe it's a conflict of interest if the vendor pays for it. What we've done with this program is allow there to be independence that's validated through A2LA, and so that the cloud provider can pay for that assessment, but it's still considered independent. What they do, though, when you go through and do the assessments, they're going to be looking through all the test cases. So we talked about the documentation earlier. What there are is, after that's 853, 853A are the test cases that says, okay, if you've implemented this, now how do I actually go out and test that? How do I actually do the assessment against that? We've tailored those to make sure that they're appropriate for cloud or that they're actually accurate for cloud systems. So we have our own test cases that are I guess, more standardized for cloud. And then also these independent assessors, if cloud providers have alternative implementations, right? If you look at FISMA and the NIST risk management framework, there's a defined way that you're supposed to implement these security controls. That's not always going to be implemented just the way that it's stated, right? There are unique ways that vendors do things. So if they have any alternative implementations, then the assessors are going to have to edit the test cases to make sure that test case actually tests that implementation. Does the test case always have to be edited? No, but usually it does, just because it's a different implementation. But as they go out and do the assessment, they're going to create a body of evidence that it allows you to authorize. Or not authorize, depending upon your risk tolerance level. But they'll create a security assessment report. And that security assessment report will also have a plan of action and milestones. So that security assessment report details, like I said, all of those risks that come out during testing. So this isn't just going to be the vulnerability scans, but any of the risks associated with any of their implementations. And all of those risks are turned into plan of action and milestones, or POAMs. And so those POAMs are basically the sort of checklist or your like to-do list for risks and how to fix them, right? If there's a risk on the system, that doesn't mean it's just going to stay there unless you There are some that are, we call them operational requirements, but all the risks that are associated, you're going to go through, and they're going to look and see how quickly they're going to fix them. If they're super high risk, so they have to be fixed within 30 days. If it's a moderate risk, they have to be fixed in 90. And if it's low, then it's basically put a timetable to it, and they're revalidated at the annual assessment. But that security assessment report, again, is going to go through and basically provide a report and a summary on all the tests that were done, have all the body of evidence with all the test cases and all the evidence associated with it, so that an authorizing official can actually go through and make that informed decision. Look at the risks and say, are these risks acceptable for use for my agency to protect the data that I want to use this system for? Then you're going to go on to continuous monitoring, right? It's sort of one of those, my vendors laugh that they all think that they toasted champagne too early when I give them their authorization, because the second they get their authorization, they actually have to start doing the real work, which is maintaining the system. And it's a lot more work than people realize. And I think this is the step that was by far the least mature when we launched FedRAMP, but also has proven to be the most important, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of maintaining the risk posture for that authorization. And it's really hard to do. It's a lot of work to make sure that you're continuously keeping an adequate risk posture. It's probably what agencies do the least of already too. There wouldn't be a CDM program if agencies were doing continuous monitoring appropriately, right? So this is something that, if you look at CDM though, we actually enforce all of that on our providers. So all of the capabilities for CDM, at least to date, are all covered within FedRAMP. But what we do, there's 3 different parts to continuous monitoring. The first is just normal sort of operational visibility. That's going to be the vulnerability scans. So now those have to be done monthly. That is for web apps, database, and infrastructure. And making sure that those on a monthly basis are provided. Most of our providers actually do them a lot more frequently than on a monthly basis. We just only want to see them on a monthly basis. Again, you're looking at this from a trust perspective. Someone else is running their system and they're managing it. We're providing oversight and continuous monitoring by looking at that sort of on a monthly basis. How are they doing? Also, there's change control. Significant change, I think Ron Ross from NIST has always said that it's the hardest to define term in cybersecurity. What is a significant change? But that basically looking at that system and what are they doing within that. There's configuration management changes, which are defined, but there's also going to be addition of services. There's going to be, changing out a firewall, changing out things like that, and looking through that change control process. We don't define significant change anymore clearly, I guess. What we've done is made sure that we provide a sort of framework for you to be able to test that change, right? Introducing a new data center is always going to be a significant change. However, is it a mirror data center, or is it actually a brand new data center with a different architecture? 2 very different types of risks that you're looking at when they're implemented, right? If it's just a mirror data center, usually on the same campus, and it's the same processes, it's the same people, it's the same architecture, you're introducing very little risk. If you're actually changing data centers and changing architectures, you're fundamentally changing the service that you authorized, and it's a whole different risk posture. So really sort of going through and analyzing when people are changing, what are they changing and what type of risk is that introducing? And then finally, incident response. This is looking at any incidents that happen with our providers. They're not just security, sometimes they're availability as well, so making sure you're looking at all types of incidents. But that's going through the US CERT process with that as well. So just to summarize what we've done with the NIST risk management framework, again, simple person, 1 hand, 4 steps, document, assess, authorize, and monitor. So that documentation phase, again, it's where you look at the NIST risk management framework of categorizing your system, selecting the controls, and implementing them. And so how we standardize it, again, we only have low and moderate impact levels right now. We're going to high and by the end of the calendar year. And so we have those baselines for that. And when you implement them, you have to use the templates. There are mandatory templates and there are non-mandatory templates. But all of the key templates are mandatory. But things like the rules of behavior, there's never going to be a template for that. But for the system security plan, like I went through, we've made those standardized and mandatory for you all. And also we provide guidance in the guide to understanding FedRAMP. Under assess, again, we've standardized that because we actually have a list of assessors that you can go to and choose from, and made it a way so that the cloud provider can choose them and pay for it themselves as well. In the authorization phase, I'm going to go into the specifics of this, but there are 3 different paths, through the Joint Authorization Board, an agency doing it, or a cloud service provider supplied. And then monitoring, continuous monitoring, that's where you're going to be looking at our continuous monitoring strategy and guide, which defines those deliverables and defines how to go through that change control process and work through incident responses as well. So what are the authorization paths? How do you do that? I talked earlier about the sort of time frame to get there, the roughly 9 to 12 months, roughly 6 months for an agency, or around 6 weeks for cloud service provider supplied. So the Joint Authorization Board are the CIOs of DoD, DHS, and GSA. They are sort of like the board of directors of FedRAMP, if you will. Through the policy memo, they were defined as the group that is going to set the requirements for FedRAMP. However, that doesn't mean they're like some like czars up there just creating these requirements because that's what they want to do. We do everything through public comment period. So everything that we've done has gone out to the agencies, gone out through public comment periods, and made sure that there's actually input by everybody into that process. But so not only do they set the requirements, they actually do provisionally authorize systems that they think are going to be used the most government-wide, right? So not everything's going to go through my office and go through the JAB to get authorized. But those services that are going to be used really widely across government, the JAB has said that they will do some of those authorizations and maintain them for agencies to reuse. Through the JAB, they have to use a 3PAO, so they have to use someone off of that list. And then through those authorizations, my office manages the continuous monitoring as well. So we provide all the oversight of those providers and continue and maintain the sort of risk posture of those systems as well. At the agency, basically this is just like you doing your authorization for any other IT system. You just now have different templates and a little more guidance to help you get through that process. But then they are validated, all of those packages are validated by my office so that other agencies can do that. Within that, in FedRAMP, we didn't try and standardize sort of the risk acceptance level. The JAB has a very high bar for security. They only authorize for security's sake. We don't have contracts with the providers, so there's no sort of agency head saying this is going live in 6 weeks, get it done. And either you know you're gonna have to accept a certain amount of risk because you have to go live, right? But the JAB, we don't have that sort of business risk or business pressure. But an agency, many times that has to happen. And so agencies are going to have a higher degree of varying levels of risks for those types of authorizations because there are business needs within that as well. At the JAB, you're always going to know that there's a certain bar that's been set for it. At an agency, again, you can accept some different risks that the JAB won't. An example of that would be like FIPS 140-2 encryption. The JAB will never authorize something that doesn't have that for their user portals. It simply won't. Many agencies will. That's a risk they're willing to accept, and they're willing to use other types of encryption or do their own sort of service around it to get around that. But the JAB won't, but some agencies do and are authorizing at that level. So again, that's where you're looking, when you go into those agency authorizations, if you're going to reuse them, it's to make sure that you actually understand the risk posture of that and the risk of the implementations. And that's what we've tried to do with this framework, is actually make that, let you have the ability to do that much easier. Through the cloud service provider supplied path, basically this is what I call the sort of field of dreams approach, build it and they will come. So a lot of agencies are hesitant to go through the authorization without some help, I guess, if you will. It's a nice way for me to put it. But it's also a chicken and the egg of, I need an authorization, I need all this level of evidence in the security package or the security documentation, but I don't want to do that. I can't do that until I actually have a contract with them. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg. How do I do that? So what we've tried to do is create a path so that providers who know that they want to work with the federal government can go through and have all that documentation there ready for agencies to authorize whenever they get a contract or whenever they want to start using that service. So basically, they go through that entire process of documenting, assessing, and providing a report. There's just not an agency who's actually authorized at that point, but the entire body of evidence is there. So it's not an authorization, but it is a complete package that's validated by my office that agencies can reuse and grant an authorization. So it's sort of like a parking lot, if you will. CSP supplied is not intended to be their end state. They will end up moving up into agency authorization or potentially the JAB if we take them on at the JAB level. What we do when we validate those packages is validate for completeness, but also check through some of the major, what we call sort of showstoppers. So things like FIPS 140-2, things like that. any sort of federal mandate, and we have a list within the Guide to Understanding FedRAMP that we use. But we validate not only that it's complete, but some of those sort of key things that you would expect to see from a provider are actually implemented. So when you go through and you actually authorize, how do you actually structure them? I talked about inheritance and talked about the different types of systems. And so I always think of it like building blocks, or I'm a child of the 80s, so Legos. Think of them more like Legos. So if you look at the sort of diagram, you're always going to have an infrastructure provider. Potentially, you're going to have applications. You're going to have platforms. But how do you actually structure that? And if you think how you're doing at your agency already, you're already doing it like this. You're just not thinking about it, because if you go and you put an application onto a VM somewhere in one of your data centers, that infrastructure is already authorized by your CIO shop. You're not going through and authorizing that infrastructure again, right? But what you are having to do when you put out that application is having to do the security around that application. It's the same thing in this model. It's just kind of shifting your mindset to sort of think of it in that way, I guess. And so when you look at the infrastructure, again, looking at them and distinctly as their own services, and thinking back through the responsibilities where we talked about was thinking about each one of these systems independently, because there are people who are responsible for the different services. So if you're looking at that infrastructure and say that's, I guess I could give an example for some of the ones that we have now. Autonomic Resources is one of our infrastructure providers. Economic Systems, probably a lot of you use them for your HR stuff. They are actually a software as a service hosted within Autonomic Resources. So Autonomic Resources would be that blue infrastructure box, and that application on the left would be Economic Systems. So again, Economic Systems for theirs, for the PE controls, they have no responsibilities for it, right? They mark inherited. And then Autonomic Resources takes care of them all for the infrastructure. But making sure when you look at those authorizations in that context, you should be doing it the same way at your agency, and it allows for the maximum amount of reuse. Right, so if you actually are using, let's say you're going to use Amazon for your infrastructure, and you're putting your application, one of your agency applications in that infrastructure, you're not going to go through and document the entirety of the system from Amazon to your application. You're going to be documenting what the application owner does through that documentation and Amazon on the infrastructure. So making sure that you're authorizing in the same way so it allows for reuse. Also, a lot of agencies right now are a lot of the CIOs and with FITARA are sort of consolidating authorizations and also trying to provide the maximum reuse across an agency. So if you tie it to a certain, say, application within Amazon, you're not allowing the next office to go through and authorize and reuse Amazon as well, because you've tied the authorization to not only the application, but the infrastructure too. So making sure that you think of it, instead of tying it all as one sort of bigger picture, sort of piecemeals and those systems independently, but they should stick together like Legos, right? So where are we going with FedRAMP? I talked sort of I guess I can pause for a minute. Are there questions around the process authorizations? I'll go on to sort of where we're going for the future and ways that we're growing. But was that confusing? Anything I can help out and people understand, or any questions on any of that? Silence. It's a Monday, right? Okay. And I am cognizantly aware that I'm standing between you and lunch, so I do get that. I think there's one question up here.
Where do you list the pre-authorized, clouds? You mentioned that their cloud service providers can present to you. Mm-hmm. Where do you list those? How do you do that?
Yeah, they're all publicly listed on FedRAMP.gov. So anyone that's authorized, anyone who has a compliant package is listed on FedRAMP.gov. And then also any of those that are in process with the job or with my office are listed, as well as agencies and cloud providers that have let us know we post on our website.
And the transparency of your process is on the FedRAMP cloud. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And then also when I went through sort of creating that body of evidence that you go through with the authorization, people always ask sort of, well, what can I see of that? The entire security package is up and hosted within OMB Max. So that's the secure repository that we use. And so once you go through, it just takes a simple access request form that you have to have an authorizing official sign off saying that you're actually a good person doing security for me, not just a random Fed wanting to see this sort of sensitive information. But you can go through and you can actually see the entirety of the security package. So that's going to include all the documentation, all the test cases, all the results, the security assessment report, the continuous monitoring. So all of that evidence is there for reuse. So you can see publicly who's up there, and then once you go through and do that access request form, you can actually see all the details of that authorization as well.
How often is that list updated?
I mean, whenever an authorization comes through, we update it. So it's always up to date.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you said the ones that are in process, the ones that you know are on the list.
Yeah.
There are some, just because they're not on the list doesn't mean that they're.
Right. So, I mean, for them to be listed publicly on FedRAMP.gov as in process, I basically have the cloud provider email us. I mean, almost every vendor who's doing it wants to be on there. I actually think we could fund the program completely just by putting names of vendors on the website saying that they're doing something with FedRAMP. But a cloud provider has to email us and then a POC of the agency, and we validate with the agency that they're actually going through the authorization process, and then we put them up on the website. And that's just to sort of give agencies a sort of knowledge that someone else is working on it so people aren't duplicating efforts, or so there can be coordination among agencies.
Thanks.
So you mentioned the high accreditation. Is that the effort for the joint effort between HISN and ICE for AWS, the high accreditation?
So that's a pilot that they're doing, but yeah, the intended goal is for that pilot would end up having a FedRAMP authorization by the end of it, yeah.
Okay, so by the end of December of this year.
Yeah, the high baseline should be finalized by the end of the year.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. All right.
So one of the big SaaS providers is pushing our agency, making the claim that the JAB backlog is greater than a year. Mm-hmm. So when we ask them, well, where are you in it? Well, we're not, because why bother? The backlog is greater than a year, but you can do it really fast in the agency, so please do.
Right. Sorry, the answer is correct, yes. So the Joint Authorization Board, we're not supposed to do all the authorizations. It's my office to do that, and I have to coordinate across DoD, DHS, and GSA and get them to agree. That's a lot of work. Also, they're not going to be doing every authorization. If you want to use the system and you have federal data in it, you should be authorizing it. That's what FISMA says. You must authorize this. By law, you must do it. I think what's a little disheartening with FedRAMP is that I mentioned the 3 different paths, and yes, the timeline is faster for an agency to do it. But if you look at these paths, I have to get DoD, DHS, and GSA to agree, those CIOs, and not an authorizing official below them. The actual CIOs have to sign off on it. I've done more in 3 years than the rest of the federal government combined. We've done 18, still working with more. There's only 17 agency authorizations to date. Yes, it's going to be much faster for an agency to do it because you can control, one, you have a contract with the vendor, but also it's your system and you want to use it. And like I said, we only do security for security's sake of the job. So it is something that agencies need to be realizing. Again, I went through the whole framework as I sort of mentioned, that was built around what agencies should be doing already. So if you're using a traditional IT system, you're authorizing it. Just because it's a SaaS provider doesn't mean that you should be waiting on someone else to do that authorization. You should be doing that at your agency if you want to use it. And frankly, yes, there is. I wouldn't say there's a big backlog at the job, actually. A lot of providers are saying that. There's not. I think we only have 2 or 3 that are awaiting kickoff that we've determined to be ready. But there's not a major backlog. But does it take a while to get through the process? Yeah, it takes on average about 9 to 12 months to get through my office. So if you want to use the system faster, you definitely should be going and working directly with that provider yourself. All right, I'll talk about where we're going, some things that we're doing over the next 2 years that will hopefully help you all out and help and just sort of mature the program as well. So we identified a 2-year roadmap with checkpoints at every 6, 12, 18, and 24 months. Originally, there was sort of an end date to that 2-year roadmap. I think the way we've rethought about it is we're basically going to consistently have 2-year priorities and sort of talk about where we're growing as a program. So it's not just going to be at the 2-year mark that we're like all toasting and having it, we did 2 years ago. No, we're going to make sure that we're continuing to show where we're progressing as a program. So we identified 3 sort of key areas within that for the program: improving efficiencies, increasing stakeholder engagement, and continuing to adapt. And so what we've tried to do, again, is say, in 6 months, we're going to do this. In 12 months, we'll get here, 18 here, and 24 here. But with those 6 month sort of checkpoints, we're going to be rebaselining. So we're going to continue to say, hey, check in and say, hey, we actually achieved this. We did publish this. This is what happened. Or say, this is a little bit harder than we thought it was going to be. We're going to sort of shift the priorities on this. It's going to take us a bit longer. Or, hey, we went faster, and now we're actually able to do more. But some of the key stuff that we're working on, one, is really trying to figure out what the baseline of use is, to your question about sort of, we don't know everything out there. We don't know what every provider is doing, or what every agency is doing. Again, I'm sure all of you would be shocked to hear that all the reporting that I'm sure your agencies, I'm sure, doing it perfectly, but all reporting to OMB is not completely accurate, right? So what we're trying to do is actually create a baseline of use of cloud across the government. And that's by taking different reporting mechanisms, so portfolio stats, FISMA reporting through DHS, as well as actually going out to industry and saying, who are your customers, and then validating that with the agencies. So we want to be able to create an accurate baseline of actually who's using cloud across the government. There's not a definitive source of that data. Not that I really want to be the definitive source of that, but I need something to do my job to help out as well, and so we're doing that. We launched a training program on FedRAMP. So if you go to fedramp.gov, it's basically sort of a high level right now overview of FedRAMP, but that'll be really built out over the coming year to actually include some really specific portions of FedRAMP within it. So first it's on the process, then eventually, the vision is to eventually have things like, when you're doing the access control families, here are things that you should be considering within each of these controls. That training module is free. It's also, it's similar to like the, security awareness training or things like that you have to do. It's not mandatory, but it is, so you at least know how to use it. So I'm not making it mandatory, but it's up there for help for you guys as well. We're also launching working groups. I know that sounds very government to say, hey, we're launching working groups. But right now, when you're looking at this, it's a good framework to do joint authorizations, right? So if there's 3 agencies using the same system, why aren't you guys working together? Let's create a framework for that to be able to happen. As you get into have authorizations as well, why don't we have a framework so that agencies can actually coordinate all the continuous monitoring efforts as well? And so that'll also reduce the burden for the first agency to do continuous monitoring for everyone else, right? Making sure that we have a sort of model for that across government. Also looking at automation requirements. So one of the things that we see within FedRAMP as you go through the process, one of the reasons it takes so long is because the documentation is not complete, right? So I talked about the sort of parts A, B, C, D, all those boxes. Actually just going through that documentation takes a lot of time just to be able to see what's in there. So what we're gonna do is create an automated tool to provide some quality checks in that documentation. So that you can basically very easily, a provider could very easily just put their documentation through it, and it's gonna tell you, I didn't check off this, or this control only had less than 10 words in the implementation statement, therefore we know it's not enough words. The key word from the requirement statement is actually in the implementation statement. But some of those quality checks that can be done in an automated way, we're going to have a tool hopefully out within the next 6 to 12 months that'll do those sort of consistency and quality checks very quickly. Also, trying to look at how other industry standards could be used within FedRAMP. If you look at NIST, the NIST framework, and if you look at FISMA, it's actually really flexible. But a lot of people it's hard to use other standards. One, because you want to make sure you have sort of a clean picture. But 2, you have to justify and go through how you're reusing all that evidence. And again, if you're just doing one system, it's usually not worth the effort to do that. But since we're a government-wide program and can kind of see all of that across all of the systems, we're looking at ways that you could potentially use other industry standards so that you could say, if you're doing SOC 2, if it's a PCI validated vendor, then could they reuse some of the evidence that you could use for your FISMA authorization as well? So looking at how we can actually put that within the context of FedRAMP. It's part of FISMA already, it's a part of the NIST framework. You just have to actually document it and justify it, and it's a lot of work. And so that's one thing that we're working on so that agencies can reuse that. We're also having overlays with other IT initiatives across the government. The first one that we put out is a TIC overlay, so Trusted Internet Connection. I think it's no shock, hopefully it's not a shock to most people in the room, that TIC and cloud don't work well together. They work together, they don't work well together. So we're trying to figure out ways to make sure that the TIC initiative can actually not be an impediment to moving to the cloud, but they can actually be working well together. And then, like I said, we're working on a high baseline as well, so we can address more types of data and have a larger marketplace of options for agencies to actually move to the cloud. So that's more the key stuff of what we have out. That 2-year roadmap is up on fedramp.gov, and then we will be releasing our first 6 months ends the end of this month. And so we'll be putting out roughly the July timeframe, by the end of July, just an update on where we are and sort of a rebaselining of some of those initiatives. That's all that I have, unless there's more questions. Everyone wants to go to lunch, right? All right, I'll stick around for a little bit, and I'm doing the Cloud 101 also after lunch. So if anyone has any questions or want to come up and ask, I'll be here for a
And
little
if
bit.
you have a completed survey, feel free to hand that to me. Thank you.